Good morning. Today's scripture reading will come from the book of Colossians, starting in chapter 3, verse 9. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free. But Christ is all and in all. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and, if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing songs and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
23 total strangers.
Under the yellow brick road.
Alone and cut off from civilization for an entire year.
So this is it, home.
This is brilliant.
I think you're exaggerating there. I used to live in a house.
Will the combination of their individual skills and experience be enough to survive?
The people that don't get stuck in are the ones that are going to struggle.
This is a place that we're going to need to put some work and effort into.
Come on, fella, let's go, come on.
What if we could start again?
Where did you wake up this morning, Steve?
Next to quite a lot of these, actually.
We have done so well and absolutely smashed expectations.
What we've got is amazing.
Eden starts Monday, the 18th of July on 4.
You may never have heard of Eden, but it's a British show, and it was supposed to be a new kind of survival show on one of their channels, and one which the actual thing was 24 daring young strangers bid farewell to the modern world as we know it, bearing their hunting equipment and their wiles into the remote Scottish Highlands with the aims of creating a new community from scratch. So 4 episodes aired, and then it disappeared, and everybody wondered, where in the world did it go? But apparently things weren't so good in paradise. The Aberdeen Press and Journal, a newspaper, provides an explanation. Almost everyone in the original group bailed out. The rest of the participants resorted to smuggling in junk food and booze, and the thing fell apart. Isn't this what happens when people say there's this new kind of community, and it's going to be the nirvana, it's going to be the utopia? This has happened over and over and over again in our society. People have tried to form these new communities in order to achieve some kind of a better life. You can think back to the Third Reich and the master race, and this was going to be a new community that was going to lead them into the future, the 1,000-year reign. You can think of the 60s where they rebelled against their parents, and free love and free joy and music and lots of drugs and all kinds of things like that. And this was going to be the new community, and it was just going to be about love and joy. And of course, that fell apart as well. We have the same kinds of things today, right? There's the promise that if you find yourself and you will find a new community, you will do better and your life will be better. It's what politicians do all the time. They promise you a new something or other. They make big promises to do something new that will finally bring everyone into prosperity and security and goodness for all. But it fails over and over and over and over again. And the reason it fails is that people have been trying to do the same thing since the Tower of Babel. You remember the Tower of Babel? What they did there was they tried to make a name for themselves, but without God in the picture. And this is the definition of a failed community. Sooner or later, it will fail because people don't get along, right? The essence of what the kingdoms of men look like is that there's evil that lurks at every turn. There's power corrupts, money corrupts, self-interest corrupts, you name it. It's all corrupt, and it eventually blows apart. Well, what we have here in this passage is something totally different. A different kind of community, right? Paul has been telling us for the first 3.5 chapters about who Jesus is. He's the image of the invisible God, and he came to earth to establish his kingdom that would put into reverse the curse, that would put into reverse the effects of the fall. He came to establish this new community, and this new community would operate upside down. Or you might say right side up, that we're upside down. But it could not be a community based on human power or human wisdom or human giftedness, but it would be a community based on weakness and humility and love. That would be the essence of this new community. So I think that's what we're talking about here in this passage. So I want us to look at 3 things about this new community. Number 1, it's a new society or different kinds of members. New society. Number 2, a new disposition. And number 3, a new power. So a new society, a new disposition, and a new power. So let's look at a new society. In his book, Jesus, the Middle Eastern Storyteller, Gary Burge, who's a professor of Bible at Wheaton College, shares a story that was told to him by a theology professor who had once worked in Jerusalem. The professor spoke Arabic, so he had access to the Arab Christian community. Over numerous conversations, he heard the same story over and over again. Here's the story. Not long ago in Jerusalem's famed Hadassah Hospital, an Israeli soldier lay dying. He had contracted AIDS as a result of his gay lifestyle and was now in the last stages of the disease's terrible course. His father was a famous rabbi, and both he and the rest of the family had disowned him. He was condemned to die in his shame. The nursing staff on his floor knew his story and carefully avoided his room. Everyone was simply waiting for his life to expire. The soldier happened to be part of a regiment that patrolled the occupied West Bank, and his unit was known for its ferocity and warfighting skills. The Palestinians living in occupation hated these troops. They were merciless and could be cruel. Their green berets always gave them away. One evening, the soldier went into cardiac arrest. All the usual alarms went off, but the nursing staff did not respond. Even the doctors looked the other way. Yet on the floor, another man was at work, a Palestinian Christian janitor who knew this story as well and also knew the meaning of the emergency. Incredibly, he was a man whose village had been attacked by this soldier's unit. When the Palestinian heard the alarm and witnessed the neglect, his heart was filled with compassion. He dropped his broom, entered the soldier's room, and attempted to resuscitate the man by giving him cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The scene was remarkable. A poor Palestinian man, a victim of this soldier's violence, now tried to save his enemy while those who should have been doing this stood on the sidelines. This is the new people that Jesus came to establish. Radical people that love their enemies, that love the unlovely, that hold all people as made in God's image, that are willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of another. Look at the list that he gives us. In verse 11, here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but Christ is all and in all. All of these categories would set off alarm bells. Jews hated Greeks and did not want to be with them. Greeks considered anyone that didn't speak their language to be a barbarian, and they looked down on them. The Scythians were a particularly violent group of barbarians that everyone hated, and they had conquered a certain portion of the known world and had complete and utterly destroyed it because they were a violent people. And that's just the racial aspect, right? There was also the religious aspect, the circumcised, the uncircumcised. Jews didn't want to be with anybody who was uncircumcised. And then think about slaves. They would never be considered equal to their masters, ever. And yet he's saying there's no difference here between slaves and free, and no difference between barbarian and Scythian and Greek and Jew, and all these things. All of these become part of this new community. Paul is saying that anyone and everyone, all of these categories are welcome in the kingdom. Anyone that would make Christ all, that is, make Jesus the center of the universe. Anyone that would do that is welcome in this community. It doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter. So what's the problem? Well, here's the problem. You have to get your security and significance somewhere. Everybody does. So if you're not going to get it from God, you're going to get it from something, right? And it's usually going to be in a comparison battle with someone else. You have to feel superior to someone to feel comfortable, right? Or to feel good about yourself. And so we find our security and our significance in people around us. And even we who say we worship God find our significance and our security in people around us. We need to feel superior to them in some way to feel good about ourselves. So let the comparison game begin. Race, money, talent, looks, success, and on and on. You've got to be better than others to feel secure. But there's some good news. If you're like most people, you're way above average at almost everything. Psychologists call this the state of illusory superiority, and it's also called the Lake Wobegon effect, where all the children are above average. It simply means that we tend to inflate our positive qualities and abilities, especially in comparison to other people. So there's numerous research studies on this, and they've revealed this tendency to overestimate ourselves. For instance, when researchers asked 1 million high school students how well they got along with their peers, none of the students rated themselves below average. As a matter of fact, 60% of students believe they were in the top 10%. 25% rated themselves in the top 1%. You'd think college professors might have a better self-insight, but they were just as biased about their abilities. 2% rated themselves below average, 10% were average, 63% were above average, while 25% rated themselves as truly exceptional. Of course, it's statistically impossible, right? And one researcher summarized the data this way. It's the great contradiction. The average person believes he is a better person than the average person. Why are we doing that? Because we're trying to get our security and our significance, like the Tower of Babel. Like every new community that has come on the block, this is the new thing. We're trying to get our significance and security without God in the picture. And so we look to each other to validate ourselves. But what Paul is saying is none of that matters. Not your background, not your race, not your money, not your talent, not your brains, not your looks, not how moral you are, how good or kind you are. None of that is particularly important in the kingdom of God. This is a new society that is measured only by Christ and our relationship with him. Now, from that flows all kinds of stuff, right? But that is the essence. That is the center. Period. Full stop. And from that relationship comes a new disposition, which is my second point. A new disposition. So that's the new society. How about the new disposition? Verse 12. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. So we have this whole list of things, right? And I need to stop saying right because somebody pointed it out to me that I say right all the time. So if I start saying right, just raise your hand, okay? I say stuff that's just on my mind in the moment. It's so dumb. All right. So anyway, we have a whole list of things here. But did you notice that 14 says, above all these, put on love? It's almost like he's saying this is a summary of the rest of these. And love is the summary of the rest of all these things. So that's what I think Paul is actually saying here. So look at each one of these and see if you're measuring up. Compassionate hearts. Hearts that are given to mercy, that are given to compassion, that feel what someone else feels. See, few people do things in a vacuum, right? Few people do bad things in a vacuum. Usually there's a reason for it. A struggle, a background of abuse, a present difficulty, or any number of other reasons. We don't see any of that. All we see is what they're doing and how we react to what they're doing. And usually we don't react with a compassionate heart. But a compassionate heart would say, maybe there's something going on here in the background. I'm terrible at that. Anyway, kindness. The quality of being warm-hearted, considerate, humane, gentle, and sympathetic. Humility, the disposition of valuing or assessing oneself appropriately, especially in light of one's sinfulness or creatureliness. Meekness, acting in a manner that is gentle, mild, and even-tempered. This, by the way, these definitions are all coming from the lexicon, the Greek lexicon, from the original words for each of these things. So it's really authentic. I mean, really authentic. So just take it to heart, okay? Patience, patient endurance of pain or unhappiness. Bearing with one another to endure something unpleasant or difficult, whether on one's own behalf or on behalf of someone else. Forgiving one another. We talked about this last week. Not holding grudges, not holding things against each other. Some of us need to do this. Some of us need to begin this with our spouses and then move outward from there. Doesn't this list seem impossible to you? So whenever I'm preaching on something, it kind of just like, I have an issue with all of it. And I just had such an issue with this week. I wasn't kind. I wasn't humble. I'm sure my wife didn't notice, but I wasn't all these things. And I come to the list and I say, ouch, ouch, that hurts. I'm not good at this. So if this is the list that is supposed to characterize a Christian, doesn't it make you wonder if you're a Christian? Some of you are far better at this list than I am, and even some non-Christians are better at this list than I am. So what are we supposed to do with this list? Well, two things. One, yes, we're supposed to strive to do what it says. You can't get around that. This is what's written here, and it says, do these things. So we should strive to do them, okay? I don't want to get around that. I don't want to erase that. I don't want to say you shouldn't. We should. If in doubt, be humble. If in doubt, be patient. If in doubt, be kind, right? But two, we have to recognize that this list is not what defines us. It is not what defines us. Because if this is the list that defines us, and by the way, this is why many non-Christians are really good at these lists, because this is what defines them. This is what makes them who they are. This is the important thing. So they go out and they do all of these things, but this is not what defines us. Right? Right. It's so easy to get these things mixed up. So yes, all of these things are evidence of the Christian life. And we should have evidence. If you have no evidence of getting better at these things, then maybe you need to think about, is Jesus really at work in my life? There should be some kind of progress in these. But it is not what defines us. What makes us what we are is Jesus and what he has done for us. This is what makes us Christians. And from that comes a list like this. We've got to get the order right. It is always, and I said it a number of weeks ago, the indicative comes before the imperative, right? Who you are in Christ has to come first, has to define you before you have a right perspective on what you're supposed to do. So this list, it's fruit, right? Fruit of the Spirit. What's interesting about fruit of the Spirit is that it's singular, and so they all go together. In other words, some people are better, more loving, and some people are more patient, and some people are more kind and whatnot. It's a personality thing. But what happens here is that they all are together. You grow in all of them. You grow in your humility, your meekness, your patience, your forgiveness. All of these things Jesus died to give us, to produce fruit in us. And so when I get that, when I get what he has done for me, then I can continually crucify these things to him and let him worry about the results. It's about relationship. So the list is important. I don't want to minimize the list, but I want to say your relationship with Christ is what defines you, and the list comes from there. And what Jesus says to you is, I forgive you for the miserable failure you've been to keep these things. I forgive you for that. I have really needed that this week. And from that, all kinds of good things flow. So how do we get there? What's the new power? Well, let's start that with verse 15. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. So these are the things that are produced by the Spirit. Where there's love, there's peace. Where there's peace, there's love. These things all go together. As I've already said, you want to have love for others and for Jesus. We must let the peace of Christ rule in our hearts with thanksgiving. And thanksgiving, of course, is something we can give thanksgiving, but it's also a fruit that he works in us. It's this round cycle. All of these things, by the way, all of these things are, sometimes he asks you to step out in faith and do them, and he changes your heart later. And sometimes he just works them in you as you pray to Jesus. So there's yes, you need to do all these things, but knowing that Jesus, his peace needs to rule in our hearts. So how do we do these things? I think he gives us a formula in verse 16. Listen to verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. So let me take the middle phrase first. Part of the power that he uses to change us is the way we teach and admonish one another. We cannot be an island. We cannot be an island. When we talk about helping one another follow Jesus, it's not just a catchy phrase. It's actually right here. It's actually here in the Bible, and that's what this is saying. So most of us have blind spots. As we've seen, we've overestimated our abilities, and we overestimate ourselves, but there are things in us that we don't see that everyone around us can see. And here's my question for you. Would you be willing to give someone permission to say honest and truthful things to you in your life? Not what you want to hear, not just have a friend that will just say all the wonderful things you want to hear and just build you up because it's all about you. No, that's someone you would give permission for someone that loves you. Maybe not your spouse. I don't know if that works, but for some of you it works. In my case, of course, it works great. But someone that would be, that you would give permission to say, hey, I see this in you, and I'm concerned about this pattern in your life. How else are you going to see it if you don't have someone that loves you that will be able to tell you that? I'm asking you to find someone if you don't have that person in your life. You give them permission, okay? But now let's look at the other two. The other two, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, and then singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Head and heart, head and heart, head and heart. Here it is. The new community that Jesus called us to requires fuel that begins in our minds and then travels deep down into our hearts. These are absolutely indispensable for it to be a new community with a new disposition. We got to be in the Word. I say this all the time. I know I do. I know I harp on this, and it just seems like the old-time stuff. And I used to, when I was a kid, my mom would say, you need to get in the Word. You need to be in the Word. And my dad would weep at the breakfast table because us kids weren't in the Word very much. And we all like, whoa, he's weeping over that. And I just remember we all snuck away like, I mean, I don't want to throw a guilt thing out there, but the truth is we've lost what it means to be people of the Word. We've lost it somehow. And we need to let that Word dwell in us richly if we want to be this new community. I know I harp on it all the time, but the new community that Jesus called us to is a community that pushes hard against hurry and busyness. It's a community that takes time to hear from him. We've got to be in his word, but it also has to affect our emotions. Yes, I said it. In a Presbyterian church, it's got to affect our emotions. I can't take this any other way. Music is emotional. For singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, why does he say that? Music is emotional. It is manipulative by its very nature. It manipulates your emotions, but in this case, it manipulates your emotions to be open to hearing and letting the word of Christ dwell in us richly. This is what the music does for us. See, emotions aren't bad. It depends on how we're using them. And we sing with thankfulness. What are we getting emotional about? What are we thankful for? So we've got to see this. We've got to see Christianity for what it is. We are thankful because we've been rescued from the pit of despair. We've been saved from a life of always needing to measure up. We've been freed from the chains of insecurity and all the ways that it makes us focus on ourselves and be critical of others. We've been freed from the guilt of our sin and the shame of our sin. We've been liberated from our brokenness, where once we wanted to hide the cracks in our cistern, we no longer worry about these things. That's what the new community is. Why is that? Because the Lord of the universe went to the cross and paid the ransom with his own blood. It's because of Jesus that we have this new community. Now, listen to this about Jesus. and how he brought a new community. In his book, Who Is This Man?, John Ortberg writes this about Jesus. In some ways, our biggest challenge engaging Jesus' influence is that we take for granted the ways in which our world has been shaped by him. For example, children would be thought of differently because of Jesus. Historian O.M. Bakke wrote a study called When Children Became People, The Birth of Childhood in Early Christianity, in which he noted that in the ancient world, children usually didn't get named until the 8th day or so. Up until then, there was a chance that the infant would be killed or left to die of exposure, particularly if it was deformed or of the unpreferred gender. This custom changed because a group of people who remembered that they were followers of a man who said, "Let the little children come unto me." Jesus never married, but his treatment of women led to the formation of a community that was so congenial to women that they would join it in record numbers. Jesus never wrote a book, yet his call to love God with all of one's mind would lead to a community with such a reverence for learning that when the classical world was destroyed in what are sometimes called the Dark Ages, that little community would preserve what was left of its learning. In time, the movement he started would give rise to libraries and then guilds of learning. He never held an office or led an army, and yet the movement he started would eventually mean the end of emperor worship, be cited in documents like the Magna Carta, begin a tradition of common law and limited government, and undermine the power of the state rather than reinforce it as other religions in the empire had done. It is because of his movement that language such as "we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights," entered history. The Roman Empire into which Jesus was born could be splendid, but also cruel, especially for the malformed and diseased and enslaved. This one teacher had said, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me." An idea slowly emerged that the suffering of every single individual human being matters, and that those who are able to help ought to do so. Hospitals and relief efforts of all kinds emerged from this movement. Even today, they often carry names that remind us of him and his teachings. Humility, which was scorned in the ancient world because enshrined in a cross, and it became enshrined in a cross and was eventually championed as a virtue. Enemies who were thought to be worthy of vengeance, help your friends and punish your enemies, came to be seen as worthy of love. Forgiveness moved from weakness to an act of moral beauty. Even in death, Jesus' influence is hard to escape. The practice of burial in grave clothes or cemeteries was taken from his followers. It expressed the hope of resurrection. Death did not end Jesus' influence. In many ways, it just started it. Do you see what Jesus has done with a new community? He has changed the course of the world. And do we think that we need power or we need politics or we need anything like that to change the course of our own country? No, what we need is weakness, and we need love, and we need laying down our lives for one another, and we need sacrifice for our neighbor, and we need compassion, and we need forgiveness. These are all the elements of the new community, and what we need most of all is Jesus, the crucified one, the ultimate example of humility, who would give his life to forgive arrogant people like we are. That's the gospel. See, Jesus is the gospel. He really does change everything. Let's pray.